It has to be manageable. We'll come back to the manageability of indicators a bit later. It has to be feasible from a resource point of view, consistent with budgets. Now, what I sometimes find difficult in government is that you have different categories. You have categories of organizing an organization with, divisions, chief directors, directors, and so on. Then you have categories of projects. Then you have categories of indicators. And then you have the budget process with programs and things. And these things are not necessarily synchronized, which makes it very difficult, because that means you have to have a kind of set of performance indicators for every different kind of structure, which is very confusing to someone that finds himself on the interface of all 3 or 4 different configurations. For me, a very important thing about indicators is that it should serve improved quality and productivity. One should really be able to say that if I can achieve this indicator, if I can achieve the levels suggested by this indicator, it will reflect positive on my own productivity and the productivity of the unit that I manage. Now, you know the indicators that you as a department or the province has to report on. Some of them, whether you achieve them or not, it doesn't really tell you anything about whether you are more productive or less productive. We're going to talk about the ownership and accountability a bit later on. I just registered this. They should be unambiguous. They should be clearly formulated. They should not be contradicting or vague. They must be transparent. That brings us back to the open budget project and the importance attached to transparency, which means people outside who pays for you and my salary are entitled to know what you want to achieve and should be able, in a democracy where accountability is important, to understand whether you are doing that and how you're accountable for that. They should be reliable, which means they should be valid. We heard this morning Nick talking about the differences in the different systems or the different surveys and the different information that is generated. That is the sort of thing which creates doubt about what you're doing. Now, the role of researchers is to actually reveal these sort of things. It's important, but we can't just leave it there. One must get to the point where we say, this is the information that we use. When we measure ourselves, when we want other people to measure ourselves, and this is why we think it's valid, or these are the shortcomings, but this is the best we can do. But it has to be valid, it has to be accurate, and it has to be in time. It's useful to the public. We'll show in a moment, I'll show you a slide as I see who are the different sort of groups in a country that demand information from a government department. But they should be useful as indicators of value for money for taxpayers. And then finally, a point to which I will also come back to at the end, they have to incentivize and sanction managers effectively. And there should be an ethos in an organization that you are expected to explain your performance in terms of these indicators. Not an administrative exercise. By way of an example, if you, I don't know what it's like in your own organization, many organizations would have a quarterly discussion between the manager and people reporting to the manager. So the director would be called in maybe once a quarter by the chief director and have a discussion, not as an exam where you can fail necessarily or pass, but as an instrument in development of your personal abilities. But these things should be part of that discussion, which will be an indication that these things are serious and they're worthwhile for me as a manager to actually pursue. If it's just having to tick off whether you've reported on that and that's the end of the discussion, that will remain a side thing. Okay, what about the hierarchy and the internal consistency of performance indicators? Okay, so what I've tried to put here is a kind of grid. So let's say we think of the department, the educational area, educational family. We would have the Department of Basic Education, and the boldness of the letters and the size of the letters, in a sense, supposed to reflect some kind of hierarchy. So only the Department of Basic Education is in very bold, big letters. Then provincial departments, and if you think in organizational terms, the departments would have divisions, chief directorates, directorates, sub-directorates, you would have districts, you would have schools. So where do the KPIs fit in? Well, they would be linked to the divisions and the different levels, which would have goals and KPIs. They may not be the same, but they could be the same. Then you have the budgetary process, and that's the point I made earlier. These things are not necessarily perfectly synchronized. But you would have budget programs. Sometimes a program is linked to a division. Sometimes a program may be cross divisions. Although that then more becomes, sort of like a project. So programs would have goals and KPIs, sub-programs, projects. Now, especially, I see more and more one finds in government the use of projects. So you actually have a matrix scheme of management, because people report in the line function, but they also report functionally with reference to projects. What is important is that people, when they are managing a project, should get proper authority and a budget, so that they can be held accountable for. What very often happens in government is, I'm chief director of department. Now the head of the department thinks there's a project that needs to be done, important, next 6 months, devote a number of people there. Then I walk into that project as a chief director, and the project manager is director, and now I want to throw my weight around because I'm more senior. If you want to have success with a project and achieving project indicators, hierarchy should disappear. It should be a functional relationship, and there should be funds allocated, and you should actually forget about the line responsibilities for the purpose of that project. If that's not done, the project will suffer as a result. But anyway, you have to have this sort of matrix, ability of matrix management, which means that you have down the line programs and across the line projects. The same as sub-programs, and you could have projects between departments, between divisions in a department, between chief directors and so on. And all of these things generate KPIs. And the reason why I think, precisely because of this possibility of the multiplication of KPIs, each point should try and focus on KPIs and not I's, or even not PI's, but KPIs, key performance indicators. I don't think one can effectively manage more than 5 or 6 goals wherever you sit in the organization as a manager. You're bound to neglect some, and then you could just as well have left them out right from the start, and make sure that the ones that you focus on are the ones that really make a difference. So this is within the organization, all the information that will be generated from the point of view of effectively pursuing the strategic goals of the department. But these are not the only stakeholders in what is happening in the department. So at the right-hand side, I have a list of stakeholders which presumably have an interest in what is happening in education. And each of these stakeholders, from time to time, also demand information in a more or less structured form. So you would have taxpayers. Remember the very first quote that I presented made the point of the taxpayer that is looking for value for money. So the taxpayer, the way in which the taxpayer's request for information reaches the department is through Parliament, who's supposed to be the custodian of the public purse, the Auditor General, who is a very important agent of Parliament, the national and provincial treasuries. So these are the organizations which also set imperatives for information and expect compliance with performance or indicators of some sort. So if you're sitting in a school or in a district or in a province, you know, the requests rain down from, I mean, the Education Department in KwaZulu-Natal has to report to the Department of Basic Education in Pretoria, has to report to the Provincial Treasury in KwaZulu-Natal, has to report to the National Treasury in Pretoria, has to provide information to the Auditor General. So how do you survive? Employers have a stake in what's happening in the Education Department. Labour unions, I'm told that labour unions were part of the definition of the performance indicators or the predetermined objectives to which all of the education institutions have to report on. Teachers play a role. We know the strength of the teachers' union in South Africa. Presumably parents, especially at the school and the district level. So this is the clientele, in a sense, which the Education Department faces. So what are the types of indicators? Well, if we, for the moment, distinguish between goals and indicators, we have a set of goals, however defined, and then we have the realm of indicators on the other side. So, you could have input indicators. For instance, the teacher-learner ratio. Whether it's 25:1 or 30:1 or whatever the case may be. That tells you how many teachers should actually be employed in order to render the function or the service of education. Then you would have output indicators. So the grade 12 pass rate, the higher the better. We learned from Nick about effective enrollment as opposed to nominal or just sort of the figure of enrollment. Which brings one to outcome. The difference between output and outcome in one sense would be the difference between enrollment and a pass rate and effective enrollment or an effective pass rate. So the literacy rate, the ability to actually pass an entry exam after matric for a higher education institution. That would be maybe more of an outcome indicator than just the passing of the matric certificate. Then there are also indicators related to the process. You know, how many exam papers were marked per time unit? So you can get different categories of indicators. But they convey different information, as I'll show you in a moment. What is important, of course, is that they should, as I said right at the outset, should serve the goals. So when one is looking at input, you would probably be, and this I think accords to the information that I also think that Mr. Barberton conveyed to you. So when you have the level of input, how big is my budget this year? It's an input indicator. How many teachers can I employ? How many posts do I have in my division? It's about economy. So an indicator will tell you, you know, am I better with the economy of my business if I can say, well, last year I was able to render a certain output with 5 people, I can now do it with 4. Or I can work with a 20% less budget, whatever the case may be. Efficiency has to do with the conversion of input into output. And it cuts through both the output, input, and the process indicators. Effectiveness is now when we start thinking, I mean, it's not for nothing that Nick used the word effective enrollment. It's about effectiveness. We all know the story about the Model T Ford that was, for the time, a very efficient assembly line product. But the consumers had moved on, and it was no longer effective in terms of consumer demand. The same example with the mechanical watch that the Swiss were so famous for. And they totally, you know, misjudged the effectiveness which the digital watch would have, and they lost market share until now they have a digital and a mechanical watch. So we've got many examples where there was a lot of efficiency, but not necessarily effectiveness. And equity is obviously, in the South African context in particular, a very important part of the outcome process. So we would have, that's why we have all these research results about effectiveness and also about how equitable is our educational system. And we now realize that even though it's equitable in terms of the amount of money, it's still not effective in terms of the results across the different population groups. So, how many indicators would be appropriate? But maybe I have to ask you first, where you sit and where you work. How many indicators demand your attention? For whom of you, it's 5 or less? Between 5 and 10?
Is it for a goal or for a program?
Indicators, things that you have to report on and which you have to spend time finding out whether, you know, this indicator is being achieved in my division. 10? 20? 5? Okay. Do your own assessment. But it's not only about quantity, it's also about quality. So when I think of this, I thought, you know, what are we dealing with? Are we dealing with sand pebbles or blue diamonds? And presumably the one is scarcer than the other. And the one is also more valuable than the other. You know, unless you can make sand out of, glass out of sand pebbles, I can think of very little other uses except basking in the sun on them. But blue diamonds are hard to get and very valuable. And I think that's how I would be thinking about, you know, is it really worth the effort to try and get a lot of people to put energy into this? Key means key. Again, I think it's probably in order to make the distinction between key performance indicators, and indicators. What type? Where do I put my biggest focus on? On input indicators, process indicators, output indicators, or outcome indicators? And how many? As I say, I think especially if indicators are your preoccupation as something you want to achieve, I don't think one can try and keep all the balls in the air with too many indicators. what really impresses you is the juggler with 4 of those things that he juggles and keeps on catching behind his back and everything, you know, he's in control. But if you try and be too ambitious, you know, every now and then a skittle will fall. So the focus is important. And then the reporting lines also. I'm going to say a few things about reporting lines in a moment. So, I've tried to put this in this diagram. You as a manager has a responsibility to be selective and decide these are the key performance indicators. If I can succeed in delivering on these, that will be the best contribution I can make to the strategic goals of my organization. Then there are the wider ambit of the organization's KPIs, with which you should be consistent. Sorry. Then you get to the stakeholders level. And at that point, I prefer to talk about PIs rather than KPIs. And then you get to the all and sundry, ad hoc and occasional, and that's where I would like to use the word I. These are indicators. They may be very important, but the question you have to ask is, you know, are they so important that they also become a key indicator for me? Or do I accept a bit of distance from them? Yes, I will report where and if needed, but you know, my head, I don't mind if my head is put on the block for them, because they are not going to determine whether I'll be promoted or, you know, whether I'll get a sort of clean audit next year. So, this may be a bit controversial. My suggestion would be that the most important thing for any manager, that's why this is in bold letters, is to manage the program performance network, which is the exact term that I think Mr. Barberton would be using, to manage my program and the performance associated with my program. Those are the inner KPIs. And then there's the evaluations framework, which is also important, but I would suggest less important. Then there's the government-wide monitoring and evaluations framework, also important. I mean, the minister can eventually force you to disclose information, even if it's not important for your promotion. But it certainly, you know, if you are, you know, 11 o'clock at night have to do something, it certainly plays second fiddle to the others. And then finally, there's the statistics and service framework, which may at times be very important, otherwise the big sport can't do his research, and so can RECEPT. Can also not do their work, so none of these are important. But yeah, I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. And the point is that, you know, you can be inundated with requests. I've had the same experience where an LP phones Member of Parliament and wants information, and the minister then, if you say, well, I can't do it, I'm busy with my own KPIs, then the minister would phone you half an hour later because the LP phoned the minister to reprimand this disobedient public servant. So we all know that. But for the sake of your own, there's a story which I remember which was attributed to Abraham Lincoln, the American president, who said when he became president, he said, I will give my everything for my country, but my heart, my lungs and my liver remain mine. So there's a point where you have to protect yourself against excessive demands. Okay. The question of ownership. Who determines the indicators? Now, we've already actually discussed that. We get indicators from all different angles, from the National Department of Basic Education, the National Treasury, the Provincial Treasury, labor unions. If the province is there, they get it from the National Department. If you are in a district office, you get it from the province, and so the school governing body and the school principal. Who determines the objectives or the indicators which govern and which, in a sense, structures your activities in your managerial capacity? And my contention is that the best indicator is the one which has your commitment. And when are you committed? Where you feel you were part of this and it makes sense to you. So when would an indicator have the best chance of success? Firstly, the closer the indicator is connected with the goals of the department, obviously, we've said that already, or the division or the program being managed, or even the project. The closer it is to the criteria by which your success and achievements are assessed, and in my view, ownership determines commitment. The less the ownership, the more it becomes an administrative task devoid of commitment. And when you get to that point, you really, loses its meaning. When I was in the management of the university, I once asked the finance director, because they had to, every quarter they had to submit information to the National Treasury about the university's finance. So I said to him, now, these reports that you sent through, how many times have the National Treasury come back to you and talk about this and discussed it? And he said, not once. So I was asking myself now, what is the use of this? And for me, I don't know, there's not an easy answer to this. But I've always had this problem of how do you actually synchronize what you are doing for the organization in which you are primarily working and responsible for with all the other demands. The ideal thing for me would be if it could be one set, but it's not possible. But the closer they are together, I think the better the chances of committed, effective management of the indicators. Management. Now the context for risk management in countries in South Africa is the King 3 report. There's actually been King 1, King 2, and King 3, which King 3 makes it very explicit that risk is positioned as a cornerstone of corporate governance. Now, primarily, King 3 is for private business, but most government institutions have accepted at least to subject themselves to the spirit, if not the letter of King. And in audit committees where I participate, the feeling is that even if it's not a legal requirement, it's an important guideline to commit yourself to, or set of criteria to commit yourself to. So there is therefore an increased emphasis in organizations on identifying and managing strategic risk. In fact, I suppose in most provincial, also in the National Education Department, there is actually an enterprise risk management process and the methodology that is actually applied, which looks at the likelihood of a risk manifesting and the impact if it does manifest. And there's actually a way in which you calculate, put a weight to each, and you can actually calculate for a particular risk what is the measured likelihood of that risk having a certain effect on your organization. You have now also the internal audit processes in government departments are risk-based, so they would actually come up with a design or proposal of different projects whereby they want to assess what is happening in the department with a view to making recommendations that will improve the governance of the organization. And the nice thing about internal audit is it's actually an in-house instrument of capacity building. And also internal audit plans are risk-based, so they're linked. Now, if you take the link from risk, from strategic to risk, to goals, to internal audit, which is also looking at indicators. They've got a methodology whereby they look at a particular activity in an organization, whether it's the process of managing school books, or whether it's the process of managing employee relations. They would ask key questions about compliance, about indicators, and how do you actually generate information about those things, and so on and so forth. So there's a very definite link between internal audit and external audit. We'll come back to that in a moment. And the whole process of performance indicators in an organization. This shift towards risk has been nowhere more vividly demonstrated than the fact